It was just another ordinary day in the life of a family who thought they had everything they needed. They lived in a cozy house on a quiet street, their lives filled with routine and predictable comforts. But, as fate would have it, everything was about to change in the most unexpected way. It all started with a chance encounter on a cold, rainy afternoon, a moment that would redefine what family meant to them. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the sidewalks into rivers and forcing most people to retreat indoors. Yet there was one figure out in the storm, huddled beneath a small awning at the edge of the park. It was a dog, or rather, what looked like a bundle of soaked fur shivering in the freezing rain. Its eyes, wide and full of both fear and hope, scanned every passing face as if begging for help but too afraid to ask. The family was in their car, heading home from a long day of errands. The kids were restless in the back seat, bickering over whose turn it was to choose the music, while their parents tried to tune out the noise. That's when they saw the dog. The car slowed, the windshield wipers doing little to clear the blurry figure in the distance. "Is that a dog?" one of the kids asked, their voice filled with curiosity. The car pulled over, and for a moment, the whole family just stared out the window, unsure of what to do. The parents exchanged a look. They had talked about getting a pet before, but life always seemed too busy, too complicated. Besides, taking in a stray came with risks. What if it was sick? What if it was aggressive? Still, something about the dog's desperate gaze tugged at their hearts. It wasn't just a stray, it was a soul in need of saving. After a brief, unspoken agreement, the father grabbed an old blanket from the trunk and stepped out into the rain. Approaching the dog slowly, he spoke in soft, soothing tones, trying to gain its trust. At first, the dog backed away, its body tense with fear. But after a few moments, it seemed to sense that this human meant no harm. It allowed itself to be wrapped in the blanket and gently carried to the car. Back home, the family worked together to clean up their unexpected guest. The kids were buzzing with excitement, taking turns patting the dog's damp fur and offering it bits of food. The dog, though still wary, seemed to relax in the warmth of their home. It wasn't long before they noticed just how thin it was, its ribs showing through its matted coat. Clearly, it had been on its own for a while. As the days turned into weeks, the family grew closer to the dog, who they decided to name after much debate. The once silent animal began to reveal its personality: playful, loyal, and incredibly smart. It was as if the dog had been waiting for a family like theirs, and they had been waiting for it, even if they hadn't realized it at the time. But just as they were settling into their new life together, strange things began to happen. The dog seemed to have an uncanny sense of when something was wrong. It would bark at the door moments before someone knocked or nudge a family member just as they were about to make a mistake, like forgetting their keys or leaving the stove on. At first, they brushed it off as coincidence. But then, one night, something happened that made them question everything they thought they knew about their new companion. The family was fast asleep when the dog began barking furiously, its urgent cries echoing through the quiet house. They woke up, disoriented and alarmed. The dog was standing at the front door, its tail stiff, ears perked, and eyes fixed on something outside. When they opened the door, what they saw left them speechless. And that's where the story takes a turn no one could have predicted. The events of that night would reveal the dog's mysterious past and set off a chain reaction that would forever alter the course of their lives. But for now, let's just say that this dog was no ordinary stray, and the family's journey was only just beginning. The family stood frozen at the door, staring out into the dark night. The dog was still standing there, its posture tense, eyes locked on something they couldn't see. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, but the dog didn't flinch. It was as if it knew something they didn't. The father stepped forward, hesitant but driven by a growing sense of urgency. "Buddy, what is it?" he murmured, his voice barely louder than the wind. But the dog only growled low in its throat, the sound deep and almost unnatural. The kids clung to the doorway behind him, their curiosity bubbling over, but also a shadow of fear creeping into their hearts. Then, just as suddenly as the moment had started, the dog stopped. Its ears twitched as it turned away from the door, pacing back into the house. The family looked at each other, unsure of what to make of it. Was it just an animal instinct? Or was there something more going on? They decided to leave it for the night, not wanting to overthink it. But as the family tried to return to their normal routine the next day, they couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The dog, once so playful and friendly, now seemed to be on edge. It would sit near the window, staring outside as if waiting for something. The kids tried to play with it, but the dog wouldn't engage like it used to. It was as though it had become distant, its mind preoccupied with something they couldn't understand. It wasn't until the next week that things started to get even stranger. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, the dog began to bark again. But this time, it wasn't the usual excited greeting. It was frantic, desperate, as though it was warning them of some danger. The father quickly stood, ready to rush outside, but the dog didn't move from its spot near the front door. It simply stared, its gaze intent, its body rigid. "What is it, boy?" the father asked, his voice thick with concern. The dog's barking continued, more insistent now. Without thinking, the father grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the kids trailing behind him, too curious to stay inside. As they stepped into the yard, something caught their eye. Just beyond the trees, a shadow moved quickly across the yard. It was too quick, too fluid to be a person, and it made no sound as it passed. The family squinted, trying to make out the shape, but whatever it was already gone. They stood in the yard for a moment, the cold air hanging heavy around them, but no one spoke. The dog, however, was growling now, its hackles raised, its eyes fixed on the trees. The family felt a chill creep up their spines as they followed the dog's gaze. Whatever had passed through their yard wasn't something they could explain. But that wasn't the only strange occurrence. Over the next few days, the family began to notice other oddities. The dog's behavior became more erratic, and its attention seemed to be drawn to things they couldn't see. Sometimes it would sit in one spot for hours, eyes fixed on a particular corner of the room, as if it was watching something or someone. It would growl low, the sound vibrating through the house, making the family uneasy. It was the mother who first began to connect the dots. She remembered the stories she'd heard as a child, about animals having a sixth sense, about how some creatures could see or sense things humans couldn't. Could the dog be sensing something that they weren't? Something that was out of place in their home? The more she thought about it, the more unsettled she became. There was a heaviness in the air, a tension that seemed to follow them everywhere. One afternoon, she decided to take the dog for a walk, hoping that some fresh air might calm it down. But even outside, the dog seemed on edge. Every so often, it would stop dead in its tracks, ears perked, eyes darting to the side. And then, as if nothing had happened, it would continue walking, though with an odd, cautious step. It was then that the mother noticed something else. There was a faint scent in the air, something unfamiliar. She couldn't place it, but it was a smell that seemed to linger, like something that had been there for much longer than she had realized. That night, when they returned home, the dog was no longer acting like itself. It was pacing again, its eyes wide with unease, but now, there was something else: fear. The fear was palpable, as if the dog knew something terrible was about to happen. The family tried to calm it down, but no matter what they did, the dog wouldn't settle. It was almost as if it was warning them, but of what? And then, just as quickly as it had started, the strange behavior stopped. The dog curled up in its bed, its eyes slowly closing as if it had finally found some peace. But the family couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of something far bigger than they had ever imagined. What had the dog seen? What had it been trying to warn them about? As they lay in bed that night, the house silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards, the family wondered if they would ever get to the bottom of this mystery. Was it just a dog being a dog, or was there something more? Something darker at play? The answer, it seemed, was closer than they thought. And it would be a discovery that would turn their world upside down in ways they never could have expected. The next few days felt like an eerie calm after the storm. The dog seemed to have returned to its usual self, but there was an undeniable undercurrent of unease in the house. It was as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something, though no one could say exactly what. The family went through the motions of their everyday lives: school, work, meals, yet there was an unsettling tension that hung over them like a dark cloud. It was the youngest child who first noticed something strange. One evening, as the family sat in the living room watching a movie, she caught sight of the dog standing at the window, staring out at the darkness. She thought nothing of it at first, but then she saw its reflection in the glass, a look of utter sadness in its eyes. It was so unlike the dog's usual playful expression, and it sent a chill down her spine. "Mom, the dog's acting weird again," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. The mother, who had been caught up in her thoughts, glanced over at the window. Sure enough, the dog was there, standing still, unmoving, as though waiting for something or someone to come. She walked over to the dog, her heart pounding slightly, unsure of what she was going to find. "Buddy?" she called gently, reaching out to stroke its fur. The dog flinched at her touch, almost like it hadn't expected it. It turned its head toward her with a strange, almost pleading look. "It's okay," she said, trying to calm it. But as her hand moved down its back, she felt something that made her stop. There was a deep scar, an old wound hidden beneath the thick fur. It was fresh, but it had been covered over, as though someone had tried to heal it, or perhaps hide it. The dog backed away from her, suddenly full of energy, darting to the door and scratching at it desperately. The mother's heart raced as she opened it, but there was nothing there, only the same emptiness of the dark night. And yet the dog was acting like it had seen something, as though it was trying to get outside to warn them of something just beyond their reach. That's when the phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, and when the mother answered, she was met with an oddly calm, almost rehearsed voice on the other end. "I know you've taken the dog in," the voice said. "And I need you to understand something. It's not just any dog. You're in danger." Her breath caught in her throat. "Who is this?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "You don't know it yet, but that dog has a past," the voice continued, "a very dangerous past. And so do you now, by keeping it. There's a reason it's acting the way it is. There's a reason it's been coming to your house. It's not just protecting you. It's running from something. Or someone. And if you don't get rid of it now, it could cost you everything." The line went dead before she could ask another question. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the call. Who would know about the dog like that? Who would even know it had come to their home? The mother turned to her family, trying to make sense of the mounting fear she felt. They couldn't just ignore this. But what if the dog was truly dangerous? What if it had been hiding something all along? That night, sleep didn't come easy. The children tossed and turned, the older ones feeling the shift in the atmosphere, and the youngest asking questions she didn't know how to answer. "Mom, is Buddy okay?" she had whispered in the dark, her voice filled with fear. The next day, the father decided to take action. He couldn't ignore the phone call, and he had to find out what the dog's past truly was. But the more he researched, the deeper the mystery became. There were no records, no sign of a previous owner, no one who had reported missing a dog fitting its description. Yet there was something unsettling about the dog's quiet demeanor and those strange, fearful moments when it would suddenly react to something no one else could see. On a hunch, the father decided to go back to the park where they had found the dog. Maybe someone there knew something. Maybe someone had seen something that could explain all of this. He went alone, the drive feeling longer than it should. The park was empty when he arrived, just a few walkers out on the path, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. As he walked through the same area where they had found the dog, his eyes scanned the surroundings, his thoughts racing. And then he saw it. Near the far side of the park, hidden under some bushes, there was a torn, weathered object that caught his eye. It was a collar, but not just any collar. This one looked like it had been ripped from the neck of an animal in a struggle. And attached to it was a tag, one that looked strangely familiar. He bent down to pick it up, his pulse quickening as he read the engraved name. It was a name he didn't recognize, but it sent a shock through his entire body. The collar wasn't from any ordinary pet. It was from something or someone he had never imagined. He reached for his phone, calling the family to tell them what he had found. But just as the call went through, he heard something rustling in the bushes behind him. Turning around, his heart skipped a beat. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure. The same shadow he had seen darting across his yard days earlier. The figure didn't move, just watched him, its presence menacing. Before he could react, the figure disappeared into the night. The father's hand shook as he hung up the phone and hurried back to the car. What was going on? And how did the dog fit into all of this? He didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear: the family was caught in something far bigger than they ever expected, and the dog wasn't just a stray, it was the key to a mystery that threatened everything they held dear. And as the father drove home, the image of that figure haunted him. What had they gotten themselves into? And why did the dog seem so connected to this danger, this unseen threat? As the father sped home, his mind raced with questions, each one more terrifying than the last. Who was the figure in the park? Why did the collar seem so familiar? And why had the dog reacted so strongly to it? His gut told him they were dealing with something far darker than just a stray animal, but he couldn't quite piece it together. The wind howled outside, as if echoing the chaos brewing inside his mind. When he finally pulled into the driveway, he was met with an eerie stillness. The lights inside the house were all on, and yet the usual sounds of family life, the chatter, the laughter, the clinking of dishes, were absent. Something was wrong. A cold sense of dread gripped his chest as he stepped out of the car and hurried toward the front door. The dog was there, standing by the door, its eyes wide and unblinking, staring at him with a mixture of fear and warning. The father hesitated, his heart pounding. As he reached for the doorknob, the dog let out a low, desperate whine and backed away, pacing in tight circles, looking anxiously toward the hallway. "Buddy?" the father called softly, opening the door and stepping inside. The house felt wrong, unnaturally quiet, like a dream that didn't quite make sense. He called for the family, but there was no answer. Panic began to rise in his chest as he made his way through the house, each room feeling emptier than the last. It wasn't until he reached the living room that he saw it, a figure standing near the window. The same figure from the park. Only this time, it wasn't just standing. It was holding something, a dark, tattered bundle wrapped in a blanket, its contents hidden from view. The figure didn't move when the father entered the room. It simply turned slowly, its face obscured by the shadows. "I told you it wasn't safe," the voice from the phone call earlier rang out, cold and calm, sending a chill down his spine. "You should have listened." The father took a step back, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "What do you want with my family?" But the figure didn't answer. Instead, it dropped the bundle onto the floor, revealing a sight that made his blood run cold. There, lying motionless, was the family's dog, its eyes closed, its body still. It was covered in cuts and bruises, its fur matted with dirt and something darker. The father's heart stopped. "No," he whispered, rushing to the dog's side, his hands trembling as he checked for a pulse. It was there, faint but steady. The dog was alive barely. "I wouldn't touch it if I were you," the figure warned, stepping closer. The voice was familiar now, more threatening than before. "It's not what you think." The father looked up at the figure, his mind racing. "What are you talking about? What happened to my dog?" "Your dog isn't just any stray," the figure said slowly, its voice dripping with hidden knowledge. "It was never a stray. It's been marked. And you've made a terrible mistake by taking it in." The words hung heavy in the air, each one sinking deeper into his chest. He had no idea what this person meant, but the fear in their eyes was enough to tell him they weren't lying. The dog was no ordinary animal, it was something much more dangerous. "Marked?" the father asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Marked by who?" The figure stepped forward, revealing a scar on its own neck, a scar that was too similar to the one on the dog. It was a mark of some kind, an ancient symbol burned into the skin. By the ones who control it. The ones who've been hunting it for years. You don't even know what you've gotten yourself into. The dog stirred slightly, its body shuddering as if waking from a nightmare. It was alive, but not unscathed. It seemed to be in a trance, its eyes glazed over, not quite seeing anything around it. The figure took another step, closer now, and the father's breath caught in his throat. "You don't understand," it continued. "This dog was never meant to be saved. It's part of something much bigger, something that's been following it, waiting for the right moment. And now, it's too late. They know you have it." Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the back of the house, a noise so sharp and sudden that the family dog jolted upright, its eyes now wide with terror. It ran to the door, barking furiously, as though it had been triggered by the sound. The figure's expression changed, a flicker of fear crossing its face. "They're here," the figure muttered, backing away toward the door. "They've come for it." The father was frozen in place, every instinct telling him to flee, to protect his family. But he couldn't move. The weight of the situation was too overwhelming. There were forces at play that he couldn't comprehend, forces that had tied them to this dog in ways he hadn't even begun to understand. And now, whatever had been following them was closer than ever. The sound of footsteps outside the door grew louder, and the dog's barking intensified. The father didn't need to look out the window to know that something was coming, something that was going to make everything they had been through so far seem small in comparison. The figure turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows of the night. But just as the father was about to chase after it, the door to the living room burst open. Standing there, silhouetted against the moonlight, were several figures clad in dark clothing, their faces hidden by masks. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting something unnatural, something dangerous. "We've come for the dog," one of them said, its voice chillingly calm. "And we'll take everything you have to get it." The father stepped in front of the dog, his body shaking with fear, but also with a newfound determination. There was no going back. Whatever this was, whatever this dog had dragged them into, they were in it now. And they would have to fight. The tension in the room was thick, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him as the figures moved closer. The stakes had never been higher, and the father knew that whatever happened next would change their lives forever. But as the dog growled, its eyes now alert and full of something new, something powerful, the father realized that this wasn't just about protecting his family anymore. This was about survival. The figures stepped closer, their movements deliberate, almost mechanical. The air grew colder, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. The father's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't step back. His body felt like it was on fire, a mix of fear and adrenaline surging through him. The dog, now standing protectively by his side, bared its teeth, its growl low but powerful. For the first time since they had found it, the father realized that this dog wasn't just a companion, it was something more. Something that had been born for moments like this. "We're not giving it to you," the father said, his voice shaking but resolute. He stood his ground, the dog at his feet, every fiber of his being telling him to protect it, to fight. Whatever this is, it ends now. One of the figures, tall and imposing, stepped forward, its eyes glowing brighter than before, the faint greenish light reflecting the coldness in the room. You don't understand. This isn't just about you, or your family. This dog, this creature, it's the key. The key to everything we've been working for. The father's mind raced. Key to what? What did these people want with the dog, and why had it been so important? Was it connected to the strange behavior they'd witnessed? The unexplainable fear in the dog's eyes? There was so much he still didn't know. The figure continued, its voice tinged with urgency. It's not just a dog. It's a vessel. A vessel that holds power, ancient power. We've been tracking it for years, waiting for it to reach the point where it could finally unlock what we've been searching for. It paused, as if savoring the moment. And now you've interfered. You've kept it from us, and that has consequences. The father felt his stomach drop. He couldn't fully understand, but he knew one thing for sure: they weren't going to leave without the dog. There was too much at stake, and whatever these people were talking about, it wasn't going to end well for his family. The dog's growling grew louder, more intense, its body tense like a spring ready to snap. The figures took another step forward, but this time, the father didn't wait. Without thinking, he lunged for the nearest figure, knocking it back with a force he didn't know he had. The momentary shock of the attack broke the stillness, and suddenly, the house erupted into chaos. The other figures moved swiftly, circling around him, their eyes fixed on their prize. The father fought with everything he had, but they were too strong, too fast. Then, as if in answer to the growing desperation, the dog, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, leapt into the fray. Its body moved like liquid, swift and agile, knocking one of the figures off balance with a powerful strike. The father could hardly believe his eyes. The dog, the very creature they had taken in, was fighting back, fighting for them. But just as it seemed the tide was turning, the leader of the figures stepped forward, holding out a hand. The dog froze, its growl turning into a whimper as it stood there, trembling. The father's heart sank as the figure spoke softly, "It's time. You've outlived your usefulness." There was a sudden, sharp crack, a sound that reverberated through the house. The leader had a strange device in hand, a metallic orb that pulsed with a glowing light. As the figure pressed it against the dog's chest, there was an explosion of energy, and the dog collapsed to the ground with a heartbreaking yelp. "No!" the father screamed, rushing forward, but it was too late. The dog's body lay still, its once vibrant eyes now dull and lifeless. A cold emptiness filled the room as the figures backed away, their mission complete. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The father stood frozen, the weight of loss heavy in his chest. The family dog who had once been just a stray was gone. Taken by these unknown forces. The father's mind reeled. Was it all for nothing? Had they made the wrong choice by taking the dog in? But as he knelt beside the still body of the dog, something unexpected happened. A faint pulse of light flickered from the dog's chest, followed by another. Slowly, the dog's eyes opened, but they weren't the same. They glowed, a piercing blue that seemed to see right through him. The dog stood, shaking off the remnants of its earlier collapse. The figures, stunned, looked on in disbelief. "You think you control it?" One of the figures sneered. "You think you can use it for your own gain? It's not just a dog. It's a force of nature." And that was when it hit the father: what the figures had tried to steal, what they had been hunting for, wasn't power in the form of gold or treasure. It was the dog itself. The creature had been infused with something far beyond any of them, something that could change everything. The dog stepped forward, its eyes now fully awake, and its form began to shift, its body expanding, growing in size and power. The leader of the figures, now trembling, looked up, a sense of realization dawning on him. "This isn't over," the father said, standing up, the shock of what he was seeing still gripping him. The dog wasn't just fighting for survival anymore, it was fighting for them, for their lives. In an instant, the dog lunged toward the figures, moving faster than any of them could react. The room filled with blinding light, and the father shielded his eyes, unsure of what was happening. When the light cleared, the figures were gone, their presence erased as if they had never been there at all. The dog stood in the center of the room, its form now returning to its usual size, its eyes soft once again. It turned toward the father, its gaze calm, as if nothing had changed. But the father knew better. Whatever power had been unleashed, it wasn't over. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The dog sat down beside him, its eyes meeting his as if in understanding. The family, still in shock, gathered around, the weight of what had just happened settling on them. They were safe for now. But deep inside they all knew the truth: this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. And the mystery of the dog, of the forces that had been chasing it, was far from over. The house was quiet, save for the soft breathing of the family as they huddled together in the living room. The dog, now lying comfortably on the rug, looked up at them with calm, almost knowing eyes. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, they had been in the fight of their lives, facing mysterious strangers with terrifying abilities. The adrenaline that had fueled their actions began to wear off, leaving a tired exhaustion in its place. But as they sat there, processing everything that had happened, one question remained: what did all of this mean for them now? The father stared at the dog, his thoughts racing. He had always believed that a dog could be a companion, a source of joy, but never once had he imagined that the animal they had taken in so casually would become the centerpiece of something far greater. What had started as an ordinary adoption had spiraled into an otherworldly encounter, and yet, here they were alive, together, and strangely enough, safer than they had ever been before. It was the mother who spoke first. "We need to understand what just happened. What did we just fight? What was all that about?" Her voice was quiet, almost as if she was still trying to wrap her mind around it all. The father nodded. "We have to know. We can't just move on and pretend it never happened. There are answers out there, answers about the dog, about these people, everything." The dog, hearing the mention of its name, raised its head and gazed at the father. The father's heart swelled with an unspoken gratitude. This dog, this creature, had saved them, and in doing so, had become more than just a pet. It had become a part of their family, bound to them in ways they couldn't fully comprehend. There was a bond between them now that was unbreakable. "Let's start by figuring out where it came from," the father said, determination in his voice. He stood up and began pacing around the room, trying to gather his thoughts. Who were those people? Why were they hunting the dog? The family dog shifted, as if it could sense their questions. The father sat down on the couch, the dog moving closer to him, its eyes still glowing faintly as if it were on alert. The father reached out and placed a hand on its head, feeling a strange warmth radiate from its fur. "You've been through so much, haven't you?" the father whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The dog simply looked back at him, its eyes deep and knowing. It was as if it understood every word, every thought. The bond between them wasn't just emotional, it was something more profound, something that connected them on a level beyond understanding. The family gathered their thoughts over the next few days, researching everything they could about the dog and the strange figures who had come to take it. The internet offered little in terms of answers, just vague references to ancient myths and cryptic symbols that seemed to hint at something far older than they had imagined. Every lead they followed seemed to only deepen the mystery. Who were these people? What were they after? And why was this dog so important? Days turned into weeks, and though the immediate danger seemed to have passed, the unease never fully left. The family returned to their normal routines, but something had shifted. Every time the dog looked at them, they were reminded of the unknown forces still lurking out there. The questions didn't go away, but they learned to live with the uncertainty, at least for now. But the unease was only the beginning. As the father stood in the yard one afternoon, watching the dog run freely, a chilling thought crossed his mind. Could there be more of those figures out there? Were they still watching them, waiting for another chance to claim the dog? The family had no answers, and that uncertainty kept them on edge. The father made a vow that day he would find out everything he could, not just for his own peace of mind, but for the safety of his family. They had already been through so much, and he couldn't stand the thought of it all being torn away. As time passed, the family grew closer. The dog had become a central part of their lives, and they began to realize just how much it had changed them. What had once been an ordinary life had turned into something extraordinary. Their house felt different now, filled with a quiet sense of wonder. The dog wasn't just a protector, it was a bridge between their world and a far larger, more complex universe. But it wasn't just the dog that had transformed their lives. It was the experiences they had shared, the terror, the fight, the survival that had forged an unbreakable bond between them. They had faced something they never could have imagined, and through it all, they had come out stronger, more united, and with a renewed sense of purpose. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, the dog lying contentedly at their feet, the father spoke up again. "I think I've figured out what we need to do next." The family looked at him expectantly, knowing that the journey was far from over. The mystery surrounding the dog, the figures who had been hunting it, and the powers they had only begun to glimpse were still unresolved. But the father had a plan. He had found a lead, a small clue that had eluded them before. It was a name, an old name that kept popping up in the research he had done, a name tied to ancient organizations, cryptic symbols, and long-forgotten powers. "There's someone who might have the answers," he said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "Someone who's been studying these things for years. Someone who might know what this dog is, and why it's so important." The family gathered their things and set out, knowing that the next chapter of their journey would lead them deeper into the unknown. The dog, as always, stayed by their side, a silent protector and an enigma. As they drove through the quiet streets, the father couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed darker, every noise more ominous. But he didn't let it show. They were a family, and together, they had already overcome more than they ever could have imagined. The road ahead was uncertain, and there were still many unanswered questions. But they were no longer afraid. The dog had shown them that there was power in the unknown, and strength in embracing the mysteries of the world. And perhaps, just perhaps, they were meant to be a part of something much bigger than themselves. When they arrived at their destination, an old house at the edge of town, the door opened before they could knock. An elderly woman stood in the doorway, her eyes sharp and knowing, as if she had been waiting for them. She didn't ask any questions. She simply stepped aside and motioned for them to come in. "This is the beginning," she said, her voice calm but filled with a weight that hung in the air. "The dog has led you here. And now you will discover the truth." As they stepped inside, the father looked down at the dog, its eyes glinting in the dim light. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. And this time, they wouldn't be alone. The story was far from over, but in that moment, surrounded by his family and the dog that had changed their lives, the father knew that they were ready for whatever came next. They had already survived the unimaginable. And whatever the future held, they would face it head on, with courage, with love, and with the strength they had found in each other. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: their lives would never be the same again. And that was just the way it was meant to be.